Okay, everyone. Welcome to week four. And just because I'm paranoid, I'm just going to double check I'm recording this. Yes, welcome to week four. Um, this is the first class of our part two of international political economy in modern history. We've just gone through our first part of our international political economy course, where we've dealt with the classical political economists, the critique of the classical political economists, primarily by Karl Marx, and then we've started to look at some other critical theories in international political economy. Um, we start this particular week at the end of World War II, looking primarily at the liberal global order that was reconstituted following the end of the Great War. We'll look in depth at the political economy of both Western industrialized nations, which was primarily based on Keynesian economic ideas, and then the dependencies that many new, formerly decolonized nations had with their previous imperial masters. We'll also introduce some major institutions that were designed at this post-World War II stage to maintain the liberal international economic order, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. And we'll discuss their kind of like early function, their early role in the global political economy, which would then undergo profound changes in the decades ahead, which we'll be covering in subsequent weeks. So we've obviously skipped a little bit in our history from first, going from Karl Marx to now, but this is because to understand kind of the field of international political economy, as I'll go through soon, it starts being built up formally after World War II. But there will be moments in our subsequent classes where we will jump back every now and then to provide some much needed context and historical background for more contemporaneous phenomena that we observe. So this is if I can progress my slides. These are the learning objectives for today, which you can also find on Moodle. And these are the required readings for this week. So just two this week. And yeah, hopefully it will is a little bit lighter week than the previous ones. And so yeah, hopefully you can get into these and enjoy them, and then engage with them in the book club for this coming tutorial week. So, like I even suggested just then, we will jump back sometimes to provide some much needed context for our discussions. And this lecture is mostly about the post-World War II developments, but it's important just to touch on a little bit of what happened prior to World War II to understand, why this liberal international order was born. Why was there the need for these international organizations, and so on and so forth. And I guess if we start thinking about the economic and social transformations that started to take place in the first decade of the 20th century were really, really substantial, because not only did we see the collapse of many 19th century organizations and kind of the structure of the global political economy, but also unprecedented wars and also the rise of fascism. And very importantly, I really recommend this if anyone's interested, but these dynamics at the beginning of the 20th century were really insightfully discussed by Karl Polanyi. And I believe I've got Karl Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation, as one of the recommended readings this week, which I'd really encourage you to have a look at. Polanyi is a very, very important political economist, and he discussed this transformation between the end of the 19th century to the 20th century as like a movement from this initial 19th century utopian endeavor of economic liberalism to which had hoped to set up like a self-regulating system of just the market. It was kind of like a laissez-faire market type global economy in the 19th century. And then Polanyi kind of tracks how that 19th century idea of the free liberal market really went through like substantial changes into the 20th century. And so the demise of the assumption of a self-regulating market in the early 20th century was one of the first victim of the broader global political economy changes that we saw. And particularly the First World War was really important here because the First World War opened up like new methods of industrial management and planning of economic and social affairs. As countries were plumbed into conflict and huge amounts of violence, there was a necessity to manage resources more closely than just allowing the market to decide what happened, and also the necessity for some kind of state planning as well. And out of the smoke and destruction of the battlefield emerged new forms of organization of industry and labor that provided the foundations for a new economy in many Western industrialized countries after the war. And this new economy was based on the belief that the economic process couldn't be left to the private market alone. And this is, again, the dynamics that Polanyi investigates in his book, The Great Transformation. The division between economic and political power started to become quite blurred, where it was seen to be more distinctive before then. The state's influence on the control of prices, labor, and other resources became much greater, and new mechanisms of administration and bargaining in governments were created. In some countries like France, Germany, and Italy, various interests like industrial interests, farmers and agricultural interests, the labor, and especially the military, became organized into like corporate forms, or like lobby groups or unions, or those kind of things in kind of more frequency than before. And so a technocratic vision of the economy emerged out of this kind of increasing professionalization of the state. Taylorism, Americanism, and Fordism took really deep roots as scientific management extended its reach in its attempt to make the use of labor and capital even more efficient. A couple of these mechanisms, so like Fordism, for example, reached its climax a little bit later on, but it started in this like what we call an integrum between the First and Second World War. And the introduction of these management techniques were really important to the renewed dynamism of capitalism as an integrative system following the destruction of World War One. And Gramsci, one of the authors we had a look at last week, characterized the transformation that Fordism and even like broader this kind of Americanism of the productivity that Fordism entailed. Gramsci argued that it fostered the biggest collective effort to date to create, with unprecedented speed and with a consciousness of purpose unmatched in history, a new type of worker and a new type of man. So these management techniques were not just about optimizing the production process, but actually shaping workers themselves. And this was achieved, across a span of several decades, as we'll see over the course of the next few weeks. And this is despite resistance by workers to Fordist and Taylorist work practices in the early years. And these work practices we might touch on in the tutorial, perhaps, or in subsequent weeks. But I mean, for our purposes here, you don't need to really know too much detail exactly what they entail, but it's more or less like, just-in-time production, very specified divisions of labor and various, management techniques that ensures the efficiency and productivity of the labor process throughout production and circulation. And there was an interesting dynamic as Fordism and Taylorism were brought into workplaces, where it kind of, in a way, fused the political left's demand for democratization in the factory. So there's ideas that workers were like more involved in like making decisions on the factory floor, for example. Whereas also the influence of the political right was very important, where there was that emphasis on rationalization through scientific management. So these fused together in these Fordist and Taylorist systems, which then affected the workers themselves. So at the in that conclusion of this very brief extingency back into the early 20th century and the end of the 19th century, at this time after World War One saw the birth of a new kind of world where, despite many great transformations, as Polanyi would say, there was still very much the underlying global political economy structures that persisted from before. So it's again that idea that we've spoken about in tutorials, where for instance, like a Marxist analysis of the change in historical periods would see the remnants of the old continuing with new social transformations. So after World War One, this increased industrialization, increased efficiency, and scientific management of the production process still very much maintain the privileges and structural constraints and hierarchies to the global political economy as well. Now, interestingly enough, with the demise of the self-regulating market, the assumption of also like perfect knowledge was similarly discarded. So previously, with the idea of a liberal laissez-faire, self-regulating, free market, there was the idea that there could be kind of a perfect knowledge of how this process kind of worked. But then, especially during like the late 1920s and early 1930s, when the Great Depression started to kick into gear, a lot of economic theories at that time had to come to terms with this, what was described as like a restless anarchy of the world around them. It was harder and harder to say that you could have potentially perfect knowledge of the economic system as it operated. Because prior to the 1930s, economics was kind of the science of coping with basic scarcity. And then after the 1930s and the Great Depression, it was then the account of how populations cope with scarcity as well as uncertainty. And this was a really important movement in economic theory, which will then have influence for like Keynesianism and neoliberalism in the future as well. That insertion of uncertainty and not ability to totally know everything about the economy, which would then have interesting impacts, which we'll get into, especially in subsequent weeks. So this also impacted too the idea at that time or previously that the global hegemon, which was Britain, was going to be, was a natural, irrefutable order, which would maintain forever. And so these ideas of uncertainty and even risk, which emerged after the 1920s and 30s, started to kind of shake the foundations of the global political economy, which was then, this is the time that Britain started to, circle the drain of its empire. It seems still quite strong at this time, but over the next few decades, it would slowly fall apart. Now, after the Great Depression, despite the ongoing, economic depravities, the increased poverty, unemployment, and inflation, and other economic problems, there was still some kind of stability in the system, and especially in the most powerful countries. But it did have contradictions. So, with the increased scientific processes of industrial management, such as Fordism, which didn't quite reach maturity until after World War II. And then it became the basis for a post-war boom that we'll speak about soon. But it was at this early time after the Great Depression started to be integrated into the many, major industrial hubs around the, major Western industrialist countries. And so it had started to become, initially was like a system of mass production. And by the end of its life, it became like it shaped the total way of life. So not only the intense production, economic efficiency, but also created like a new culture of work, and also a new culture of consumption too, which was a necessary factor of this huge increases of production. Like consumption had to keep up with it, and it also contributed to a new aesthetic of what modernism would look like, with its concern around functionality and efficiency. So again, despite the broader stability, there were changes very much at the below the surface level with how people related to each other, with how they understood their contribution to their work, and how these new scientific managements kind of impacted that. While alongside that, on the other hand, the economic crises that were generated by the Great Depression, the associated hardships, as well as the political consequences of the settlement of World War I, also helped fuel the rise of fascism across Europe. This is probably not a major topic for us in this particular course, because I know it is spoken about in some of your other core units. So we will now then head back over after World War II to then talk about what happened once the Second World War ended. So after, or really during the Second World War, again, a World War was really vital in terms of shaking the economic foundations of the global order. The capitalist enterprise system was in a lot of peril at the time. Not only was the rise of fascism at this time, it seemed to be defeated, but also the rise of communism as an alternative regime to capitalism that was seen as more and more attractive by countries around the world. So there was a real fear, not only from the destruction of World War II, but also the rise of communism as an alternative, that there was a real sense of concern that the capitalist system was in a lot of peril. Now, at the end of World War II, to save this system, the United States particularly as the emerging global hegemon at this time, because the other European imperial powers were destroyed from now two major world wars, with the United States were still able to avoid the vast majority of material and structural impacts of the war in their own country. And so they were also able to, of course, sell most of their products to the countries who were still in war. They emerged after World War II in a much stronger position. And so it was kind of down to the United States, with the assistance of some of the kind of decaying imperial powers, to save this system. And so there's some imperatives at work here at the end of World War II. There was the necessity to keep the existing core nations of the capitalist system together and continuing, which required expansion and efforts to avoid the spread of communism. Secondly, to find ways to invest US surplus capital that had accumulated during the war, because, like I mentioned, the United States, businesses and in industry was supplying a lot of materials and had huge amounts of surplus capital from World War II. And so they were very much concerned about finding markets abroad where the largest profits could be made. And so finding markets overseas for American goods was also an imperative, not just because of surplus capital, but also the productive capacity of American industry had doubled during the war. So it was necessary to find more markets for their products. And also another imperative, and the second last one I'll talk about, is the necessity to secure control over sources of raw material in order to meet the demand of the American industries, and also to ensure that they came out on top in terms of the world competition. And finally, to establish a global network of unchallenged military power as a way to secure these other imperatives. So secure the access to raw materials, secure markets, and also secure consumers as well. So these are some of the concerns that the United States, as well as the other decaying imperial powers in Europe, these were the imperatives that they faced. And so this helps kind of understand, well, then, how did the global economic order that we saw after World War II emerge in the way that it did? So the conference that I've also got pictured here on the slides is called the Bretton Woods Conference. This was a conference that was held at the end of World War II, just really in the right near the death end of it, where it was quite obvious that the Axis powers would have been defeated. And this was where the grand bargain of the new liberal economic order was negotiated and decided upon. It was very much led by the United States and the UK, with the United States taking more and more of a major role as the conference went on. Now, there was a pact that was signed at Bretton Woods, and importantly for us, it established two major international organizations. Firstly, the International Monetary Fund, and secondly, the World Bank. Both of these inaugurated the new era and were quickly impelled to assist with the imperatives that I described before of the rapidly emerging new hegemon, the United States. So at this particular conference, there's 44 nations that met together. And not only did they establish these two major international organizations, but they also established a new international monetary framework. And this was a time that was pinned as the beginning of global governance, where the decisions of how the post-war global economic order would operate and be governed were made. This grand social bargain that was reached at this particular conference was literally in its pact committed all sectors of society to the sharing of the social adjustment costs for moving to a new, slightly different liberal trading system that was kind of supported by embedding a liberal logic in a broader community. And the reading that you have for this week, the second reading by Rugi, talks about this re-embedding of liberalism in a broader social community, which is really important for the post-World War II economic order, because prior, the 19th century economic order, which was based on laissez-faire, liberal, open free markets, there wasn't an embedding of the economic in the political as such. It was seen as a separate system, and there weren't like social concerns attached to that. Whereas after World War II, there was this imperative, because of the other imperatives I mentioned before, to embed more liberal logic in a social community, so that the market was supposed to operate and achieve social goals. So the agreement that was signed at Bretton Woods moved away from the precepts of laissez-faire economics and the liberal philosophy of that particular strand of thought. And this kind of economic order that was seen to contribute not only to World War I, but also be influence the Great Depression and also the rise of fascism as well. So this agreement moved away from those ideas, and it also recognized, for instance, that nations could utilize methods to protect themselves from the fluctuations of international financial markets, which is capital controls, and in assisting countries to adjust to this global economic order, the IMF and the World Bank were supposed to be on hand to help. So the IMF were designed to assist countries to stabilize their exchange rates. So when they're trading their currencies, to ensure that there's regular and predictable exchange rates, and also to ensure what was called an adequate balance of payments. So this is to basically make sure that countries didn't get too much in debt, that they could basically pay off their debts and have a relatively positive trade surplus. While the World Bank was supposed to help initially address the reconstruction and development problems in the European countries, especially after the destruction of World War II. And I'm just going to touch on a little bit more detail now as to how the World Bank and the IMF are constituted, just very briefly to give us a broad idea exactly what these organizations are. They'll have a much greater role in our subsequent weeks. We're just kind of introducing them now, but especially as we start talking about the rise of neoliberalism, we'll see how important these institutions are to the global political economy at this time. Because after World War II, they were both kind of maligned and didn't operate to the full capacity of their prescribed roles for various reasons, but they didn't perform a huge role in the global political economy until about the 1970s. Now, the World Bank is made up of 5 individual entities, and the main ones we're going to focus on in our international political economy course is 2 major ones: the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or the IBRD, and the International Development Association, or the IDA. So the IBRD deals with assisting the development of middle-income countries, whereas the IDA, the International Development Association, assists with the development of developing countries. Now, the bank has its governance and legal basis contained within the IBRD Articles of Agreement, which was signed at Bretton Woods, and that contains the objectives which are focused on reconstruction and development, the growth of international trade, and also arranging loans. The World Bank, like I mentioned, was originally envisioned to handle just reconstruction lending, which was just supposed to help war-torn European economies get back on their feet. And that meant, for instance, the typical ventures that were under the bank's purview at this time were like, helping construct major dams, building roads, irrigation systems, energy projects, things that like big infrastructure projects that needed, financing and technical expertise. Funding outside of project-based lending, as that was known, was only to be permitted in very special circumstances. Now, I'm mentioning this because this will be very interesting as we track the World Bank's development through the 20th century, is that its role in reconstruction was basically stopped from the get-go. So I think the World Bank had like maybe 3 reconstruction loans or something, and then the rug was pulled out from its feet because the United States had committed the Marshall Plan, which was a huge amount of money infused into Europe to get European economies back on their feet. So suddenly the World Bank wasn't necessary. And this was because there was a really pervasive fear and an urgent fear of a communist takeover of the entirety of Europe at that time. And I think it was the Czech Republic fell to communism in the early or the late 1940s, or around that kind of time period. And that triggered the sudden imposition of the Marshall Plan. So the World Bank was suddenly cast aside from its reconstruction role, and then it reorientated itself more to development. And so that also meant a different type of lending, not just these large infrastructure projects, but also just straight loans. And this is something we'll look at more next week, and how the World Bank interacted with its developing clients. Now, again, quite briefly, because we don't have to be experts on the internal structure of the World Bank itself, but it's just worth noting that it's administered by a board of governors, which consists of a governor from each member state. So the member states, most member states around the world, most states around the world are member states of the World Bank. And so the Board of Governors is a large body with basically a representative from each state. But the day-to-day operations are managed by a 25-member board of directors. And member states basically wield power through the World Bank by holding a number of votes. So it's not one country, one vote like at the United Nations. You get votes based on the strength of your economy. So, for example, the United States has always had the greatest share of votes, which is fluctuating around 17%, and so has the deciding vote on most issues. And because it has over 15% of the votes, it can also cast vetoes to any proposal that goes through the World Bank. And the United States has also traditionally appointed the World Bank president, which is a very important office holder. Now, the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, initially set the basis of what was called the par value system, where member states agreed to keep their exchange rates fixed, but adjustable within a small amount, like 1% or so, to the US dollar, which was also fixed to gold at US $35 an ounce. So the IMF initially maintained this exchange rate system, so there was stability and consistency in the value of currencies or between various countries. Well, that was the idea. It didn't quite turn out that way, but that was the idea. Now, the executive structure of the IMF is very similar to that of the World Bank, and just like the World Bank, the state with the largest economy also gets the most votes, which again has been the United States, which has then also allowed the United States to influence both of these institutions, and both of these institutions are also housed in Washington as well. Now, the only difference being is that the IMF, the managing director, which is the leader and figurehead of the fund, is appointed by European countries and has historically been from the major European economies. Now, again, I'm doing a lot of foreshadowing here because I just want to introduce these institutions and I'm kind of foreshadowing their importance in subsequent weeks. But both the World Bank and the IMF have restrictions within their Articles of Agreement, which limits their influence from being able to intervene in the political affairs of their member states. But it was, I guess, like quite obvious even from the early stages of the lives of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund that by offering loans and financial assistance to member states, that they were able to influence the domestic political economy of its borrowers. Now, this was initially quite a minor concern. There was some upheaval and discussion and even ferocious objections by some developing countries early on, but these concerns would cascade like a snowball over the coming decades. And throughout this period of the 20th century, their power as like multilateral transnational financial institutions would become evident as key external norm generators. You know, they basically defined what development was. And they had huge influence in the financial, economic, and even political spheres. So they initially had very narrow mandates with restrictions on political interference. But they have been really at the center of many international political, financial, and conflictual crises over the 20th century and been inherently involved in the political economy of most developing countries. So just want to emphasize how important they are and how we'll come back to them in future weeks. Now, turning our attention to the political economy of Western industrial states after World War II. I mentioned at the Bretton Woods conference, there was a reorientation, again, which had already started by the early 20th century, you know, after World War I, a reorientation away from the laissez-faire liberal economic system to something where the state had more legitimacy to intervene in economic affairs. So there's more of a overlap between the so-called political and the economic. And it was mainly the ideas, well, the predominant ideas of John Maynard Keynes, who was a leading British economist who was closely involved at the Bretton Woods conference as well, and had published really highly influential works by this stage. Keynesian theory provided guidance to strengthen the private sector, expand domestic and foreign markets, and revitalize trade under kind of the aegis of multinational corporations. The importance of Keynes was that he kind of demonstrated that there could be equilibrium. So the situation in which economic forces such as supply and demand are balanced at levels lower than full employment and at any level of output and employment, which was an important development in economic theory at that time. And he was a part of what was called the years of high theory in the realm of economics, where there was various key economists such as himself, Robertson, Hicks, and many others who realized that there was a fundamental lack of information in the global economy. And this is also something I mentioned before, that there's this realization in the economics profession that it was impossible to perfectly know the economy. And so then perfect competition, which used to be a key assumption of many laissez-faire liberal ideas about how the economy worked, it was realized that this was actually imperfect. And perfect knowledge became very muddled, which gave way to uncertainty. And so inquiries then in the economics profession at this time began to grow into like the dynamics of growth. Like, how did growth happen? And growth became the major focus of the economics profession in a situation and context of uncertainty. Because of the limitations of knowledge that the economics profession identified, including Keynes, the tools to manage that reality had to be changed. And so there was a new emphasis on public policy and planning to fill the need for mechanisms of order and control. So these innovations very much reflected the events of this period, which again we spoke about before World War II, like as deflation, wage reductions, unemployment, economic crisis, and then the really devastating impacts of the Great Depression. Keynes' prescription at this time was for governments to support full employment through appropriate state spending and through investment, fiscal, and budgetary policy. So to really intervene. And so the political or the production process, sorry, of the core, Western industrialized states was thus, integrated with the political apparatus, as well as emerging international financial organizations. So there was not only, at Bretton Woods, there was not only this creation of new international financial organizations such as the World Bank, the IMF. There was also the grand social bargain that was struck through a new way of doing like liberal economics. It wasn't laissez-faire, free market, open liberal economics, but it was one that saw the role of the state as being very important to like ensure full employment, to ensure stability, for example. So, and this had a lot of a range of impacts. So these changes not only prepared the ground for a new scale of integration of also peripheral countries, which we'll talk about a little more, but it also provided the building blocks of a theory of economic development, which was supposed to guide and assist developing countries. So the focus on growth with these new economic theories, which were improved upon by new macroeconomics and new mathematics integrated into the economic thought, was ready to provide like fundamental elements of development as an idea and as a discourse. Because prior to World War II, there wasn't actually really much of an idea of what development was. It wasn't something that was a part of a common lexicon. And so these ideas of development grew from Keynesian thought and also grew from the forms of management and planning that began to be developed in the interwar periods, which we spoke about before. So after 1945, the underdeveloped world, or the so-called underdeveloped world, acquired a new position of importance in the capitalist world economy that it had never had before. And there had never existed a discourse or a way of speaking about it. So this was something, the idea of development, which was created and which we'll address quite soon. But these post-World War II industrial Western states then, therefore used these Keynesian tools to help regulate the economy. And they used it to try to dampen the severe impacts of what are called boom and bust cycles, where the economy like overheats and there's like a lot of production and creation of commodities, for example, and also to dampen the impacts of when the economy drops and there's like increased or tendencies for increased underemployment, for example, lack of employment. So there was new techniques wielded by the state to regulate the intensity of those cycles, while also pushing international liberalization. So, states then started implementing like business regulations, investing in infrastructure themselves rather than relying on the free market for it. There's industrial policies being written, even redistributive taxation, social provisions for the working class, and even limited nationalization of key industries and some decommodification of public goods as well. So this was called embedded liberalism. And again, this is what your second reading on Ruge hints at. These embedded liberal economies where liberalism was supposed to work for social goals also had an influence at the household level. Because again, thinking, using our critical lenses, it's important for us to not only think about the state level policy stuff that might be happening at any particular moment in the global political economy, but then how that filters down to the everyday community and household level, which is very much not only a process of using an ontology of relationism, how these things are connected, but also having a concern with the position of the people in society who are like workers and who are otherwise subdued or subjugated, for example. So it's always good we try to think about, well, how did these large state level processes filter down to the household? And the embedded liberal economics in the global north helped finalize the replacement of what was called the traditional extended family in the household, which was previously a historical site for virtually all the social activities. So normally, households in a lot of Western industrialized countries before World War II had an extended family. It was a whole range of individuals, familial members under one household. And this was replaced gradually by the modern nuclear family. So these were ideas that were also propagated by this new liberal embeddedness. Because the idea of the embeddedness of the economy in society produced a deepening division of labor within the family. And this was also another part of the grand social bargain, which was kind of hidden in the Bretton Woods Agreement. Obviously, it was nothing that was spoken on at all, but this is the consequences of it, because it impacted upon gender relations, and basically instigated the forces to I guess, mold the modern nuclear family as we know it today. And this was because you had in these Keynesian Western industrialized states a very powerful white male labor force who was much better paid than they had been previously, who had social protections, who had insurance, even free education, for example. And this white male labor force would earn a family wage. And then this would allow them to support a small nuclear family. So the cohabiting woman typically would then maintain the home and the family. So there was this gendered division of labor, which was promoted by these broader state level economic changes. And so notions of masculinity then became to be orientated around leaving home for work and then returning with that family wage. And then notions of femininity was associated with not only the household work and looking after dependents, but also as the consumer and as the worker's companion and helper, purchasing and preparing goods and services for domestic consumption. And this gendered division of labor was also enforced by these Keynesian ideas of welfare state capitalism, in ensuring that families that didn't have a male breadwinner were still dependent on a state bureaucracy, which is seen as like a father and this androcentric kind of figure. So in this sense, the Keynesian economic state-driven political economy of the Western industrialized states also helped influence the gender division of labor in the household in a quite interesting manner. And this is something that feminist critical political economists have noted, such as Kabir and Nancy Fraser, which is, also an interesting part of this development, which we often don't touch on. Now, we've spoken about the Western industrialized countries. We've touched on the international financial institutions. Now, let's talk about, well, what was happening with the rest of the world, the vast majority of the world. Because in the first 10 years or so after the end of World War II, there was this rise and consolidation of these ideas of development and even like development economics as a practice that was concerned with like certain questions and performed by particular individuals and generally, Western economists that were tasked to basically find out the answers to why, apparently countries in the so-called third world hadn't caught up and were not, their size were not like Western industrialized countries. So in this time, development economics constructed its object of analysis, which was the underdeveloped economy, out of the kind of in terms of like the global political economy. So comparing the Western countries to the so-called developing world. And this was really where the industry of development started to begin. And it was when there was a really large concern with the problem of development. Now, there was some precursors to this post-World War II concept of economic development, and the term development was used before the 1930s, but it was usually understood in like a naturalistic sense, where peoples would develop like over time. It was something that people would naturally grow into. And again, usually it was deployed in terms of colonial discourse, where the colonial masters and imperialist powers would, justify their stranglehold of the colonized peoples as helping to shepherd them through this slowly emerging development. But after World War II, this became an actual science. Now, the actual way in which development was to take place was at the center of development models in the 1950s. And more importantly, it was how basically, these countries were going to industrialize, because that was what development meant. The ideas of development was that, the so-called third world or developing countries or global south, had to look like Western countries to be developed. And so that meant industrialization. But it was also clear that industrialization was just not going to happen spontaneously. So deliberate efforts were required if the perceived obstacles to industrialization were going to be overcome. So this also meant then some kind of planning in the development states. So this meant ensuring like the right allocation of very scarce resources most of the time for countries coming out of colonial domination. This meant correcting market prices, maximizing savings in the national economy so they can make investments, orientating the foreign investment in the right direction, and in general, kind of like orchestrating the economy in terms of a well balanced program of economic development. So this development planning was at the outset really associated with developmental economics. Now, the ideas of classical and neoclassical theories of growth provided like the building blocks for these models. And these theories of growth saw capital accumulation, the division of labor, technological process, and increased trade as vital to increasing growth for these developing countries. So this is, again, it seemed a bit of a reflection of also many of the older ideas like, Adam Smith and Ricardo that we also saw as well. So that division of labor, increasing technological progress, and increasing trade to get, foreign, more valuable currency. So the thrust of the growth argument and the focus of these growth theories is that in order to grow, these developing economies must save and invest a certain proportion of their gross national product. So, a lot of countries, for example, in the so-called third world, obviously came out of colonial domination, and often the colonialists would have you orientated the economy of a country to one particular commodity. So it might be, for instance, like Sri Lanka, grew tea. For instance, countries of Central America, there was like Cuba, did sugar. Another country did coffee, for example. And so the idea was that in order to grow, these countries needed to export more and more and more of their product to be able to get a foreign currency, which they can then save and invest. And then once they got to a specific level of savings and investment, the rate of their growth, and this is, ideally, will depend on how productive their investments are. And the development economists at this stage would measure the productivity of investment by what's called the capital output ratio, which is like the ratio of investment to growth. So the higher the ratio of investment to growth, then the lower the productivity of capital, which meant more investment is needed for increased output, and it's more desirable to have a low capital output ratio, so that little amounts of investment sparks like a much more productivity. Then the idea was once investments were smartly made in an economy, that would create new capacities to produce, which must then be matched by new demand by the consumers in the country, for instance. So the income of workers then must also rise by an equivalent proportion to ensure there's no kind of idle capacity of capital goods. So that basically everything was kind of like sucked up. So this kind of growth model assumed several features that held quite well at that time for industrialized countries, but not really for underdevelopment contexts. It assumed like a constant capital output ratio, but it didn't really analyze the effect of price changes in commodities on the international global market, which was highly fluctuating, especially for primary commodities like tea, coffee, and so forth. And also, it presupposed constant terms of trade. But for many developing countries, the terms of trade, or the kind of the money that could get for basically its products on the global market, would be very going back and forth, going fluctuating, up and down. And so, and often the trend would be downwards, because what would inevitably happen when all the development economists are telling developing countries, like, you need to produce more coffee and tea or whatever it might be to get more money. When multiple countries who all produce coffee started to produce more and more coffee, it obviously flooded the market, and then the price of coffee would go down. So then the terms of trade would deteriorate, which meant that these countries wouldn't get the bang for their buck. And so the underdeveloped economies at this time after World War II were found to be characterized by deteriorating terms of trade for their products, and especially compared to the much higher prices that industrialized countries were able to fetch for their manufactured products. The undeveloped countries were seen as needing rapid technological change, and their prices changed continually due to a lot of inflation and the inflationary bias of their economies as well. They then had a much lower level of savings too, and so there's so many obstacles to implementing these like perfect growth models of neoclassical development economists. And so overall, the obstacles to development was the low capital availability, and although there could be some domestic savings in these developing economies through selling these developing economies through selling their commodities on the global market. Often these countries needed to then accept like foreign aid and loans and private foreign investment to try to get enough savings to actually make significant investments in their industries, for example. So again, basically what I'm trying to say here is that there's a lot of contradictions, and the models of growth that were seen as working reasonably well in Western industrialized states, when applied to the developing context, encountered a lot of different problems. And especially, the thing that we're obviously not saying here is that these models often overlooked the very different historical context of the so-called Third World after World War II, and that of advanced Western economies like the US and England a century earlier. They were totally different and very different historical contexts. These countries at the center, like the US and England, they became industrialized at a time when they could basically dictate the rules of the game, and they could extract surpluses from their colonies. And while third world countries in the post-war period basically had to borrow under the opposite conditions, there's deterioration of their terms of trade. There's still a continued extraction of surplus by the central countries, and also a position of global like subordination in terms of their relation to imperial powers. So whereas Europe was feeding off its colonies in the 19th century, it was argued even quite early on that the first world after World War II was feeding off the third world. And you can see that recorded in many statistics around that time. And one graph that I haven't included in this presentation, but demonstrates that Latin America, for example, by the 1980s, had paid an average of $30 billion more each year than it received paid to Western industrialized countries more than it receives in aid, loans, money from selling its commodities, for example. So this was the kind of paradoxes, the difficulties and contradictions between World War IV development at that particular time. Now, after World War II, with the so-called Third World, there's a huge booming of, firstly, countries, individual countries, because they were coming out of colonialism and often violently through struggles for national liberation. And there was also greater efforts to kind of orientate themselves away from these formal growth models. And there was a whole set of new state-led modernizing efforts. There was a lot of radical optimism about the material gains that modernization could bring to newly self-governing people. And the modernizing elites of what were known as the early Bandung regimes, and this refers to countries who attended the first large-scale Asian African conference, which was known as the Bandung Conference, which is a meeting of basically newly independent countries, which took place in Bandung in Indonesia in 1955. And this included India and Nehru, the leader there, Indonesia's Sukarno, Nasser from Egypt, and Nkrumah from Ghana. These elites felt that, and as well as their successors of the 1960s, they felt that their states could deliver economic development. And in this understanding, development was the path through which they were going to achieve self-determination and get international sovereign equality with the Western industrialized states. And the ideas of modernization and development was also a source of internal legitimacy for those leaders in these post-colonial states. So these leaders of developing post-colonial third world states embraced this, a vision of modernization and development, which still partially agreed with the modernization theorist characterization of the problem that I just laid out before, but then also included significant state-led planning, kind of similar to the Keynesian system we would see in the Western industrialized countries. In that kind of sense, the many anti-colonial nationalists, such as India's Nehru and Egypt's Nasser, they supported socialist projects that were committed to the post-colonial state as a vessel for modernization. And again, which was very much still intertwined with that idea of a push for rapid industrialization. The specific mechanisms and sequencing of development varied in these states, but was often carried out through this idea of import substitution industrialization, or ISI, which basically meant developing countries favored their domestic industries and looked to try to protect them and reduced reliance on manufactured foreign imports. This also meant they nationalized major industries, even in some cases expropriated land belonging to colonial settlers and multinational corporations. And there were some early gains in social welfare here, but kind of despite this approach started to backslide throughout the mid to late 1960s. There was growing disillusionment with the limitations of this approach and the limitations of many development models, as the promised industrialization, or the hoped for industrialization, and the improvement of welfare for general peoples was not coming as expected. And it was also felt by many post-colonial leaders that there was a deck stacking of global political economic institutions against them. And then this kind of helped grow a new movement where radical intellectuals in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa began to turn away from this idea of modernization as this linear progressive account where all countries will get to industrialization. And they turned away from that to try to explain the frustrating continuation of imperial domination that ensured economic deprivation continued on these long-standing geographies of racial and colonial hierarchy. Their efforts would kind of, I guess, join together or be known as the second generation of Bandung regimes. So these include like the Marxist revolutionary regimes in Cuba and Vietnam, and the anti-colonial internationalism, which kind of saw the birth of a very important 1966 conference called the Tricontinental Conference in Havana. And at this stage, dependent development theorists from these countries, and they were called dependency theorists, they thought that the subordination of the third world ought to be rethought as a consequence of simultaneous and causally connected interdependence of developed and underdeveloped spaces. And really importantly, and I'm going to butcher his name, but Argentine economics Raúl Prebisch wrote many important works here that laid the groundwork for the subsequent explosion in the 1970s of more and more radical questions in political economy from the so-called third world, which questioned the unequal exchange which was faced by developing countries through a whole set of theoretical lenses. So and Prebisch was the head of the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and also later Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Aid and Development. Prebisch developed an analysis of this declining terms of trade that I mentioned before, and he contended that the terms of trade declined due to the greater gains in productivity that accrued to the North via its monopoly over industry in comparison to the third world, which remained and only remained suppliers of raw materials. So the consequence is that their disadvantage would continue to increase over time. It wouldn't get better over time, as they would need to make more to receive the same amount of manufactured commodities than they had the previous year. So as the price of manufactured commodities continued to grow, the relative price of raw materials and primary commodities such like agriculture, rocks in the ground, and all other manner of primary commodities extracted from so-called nature, these prices kind of stabilized or stayed flat, or even often would decline. And so as manufactured prices continued, developing countries would have to produce more and more and more of their primary commodities to try to buy these manufactured commodities that these countries needed for their industrialization. So he theorized that this problem would actually become worse and worse as time went on. So far from just a tradition of kind of like colonial holdover, although that was important, the historical impacts of colonization on the so-called third world, this idea of what was called underdevelopment was a thoroughly modern product of some fundamental structural constraints in the global political economy at this time, which meant that it impacted the development prospects of the so-called third world. And these tendencies and patterns will be also something we come back to next week when we have a look at the turbulent 1970s and 1980s. Now, switching a little bit now away from the what happened in the global political economy to theory. At this point in time, and this is just going to be quite brief because international political economy as a theory started to reconstitute itself by the 1970s, because by after the 1950s, or around this time after World War II, the field of political economy was divided in the mainstream between international economics and international relations. Um, there was a movement which was arguably led by Susan Strange, and especially in the early 1970s, to bring these approaches back together to form a modern international political economy, which is where the name of this course comes from. And this is something that again, we'll touch on more next week. But just as a taste for that, the real world events that were sparking this change were really varied at this time, late 60s to early 70s. And most striking was probably the really remarkable recovery of the European and Japanese economies after the devastation of World War II. By the 1960s, a decisive shift seemed to be taking place in the balance of economic power among industrialized nations. At mid-century, 1945, 1950, it was the United States who dominated the world economy like a colossus. But its growth rate started to slow around the 60s and 70s. It got behind on a balance in payments, balance of payments, which means it had huge amounts of debt, and especially because it was prosecuting wars in Korea and Vietnam. And the US seemed to be at this stage on the brink of decline, whereas continental Europe and Japan were roaring back to life, and were once again forces to be reckoned with. And so it seemed that America's moment of economic dominance or hegemony appeared just about over. Obviously, that was mistaken as it turned out. And at the same time, and concurrently, post-war decolonization had brought new attention to the challenges and dilemmas of economic development, as I've already mentioned. And those pressures were mounting for what was called a new international economic order that would transform the rules governing relations between the wealthy North and the poverty-stricken South, which we'll also address next week as well. Behind these changes was, a growing interdependence of national economies. Links between the national economies after World War II had reached a high point by the 60s and 70s. Trade and capital movements were tightly controlled. Insularity was also the rule, but there started to become like a gradual liberalization of barriers, and especially among the industrialized countries. And this was promoted by the more liberal policies of the United States, which started to evolve over the late 60s to 70s and shepherded by the World Bank and the IMF. And slowly, the insularity of these national economies was replaced by more competition, where tariffs declined and more and more trade continued to be increased. Trade, I guess, grew more rapidly even than output, which brought greater openness and mutual dependence between countries. And then financial flows began to accelerate as well from the late 1950s to 1960s and onwards, which are processes, again, we'll focus on next week. So by the end of the 1960s, it was kind of evident this time that the expansion of international economic networks had reached a critical point. Power started to seem like it was slowly slipping away from states, limiting their ability to reach the goals of the liberal embeddedness program, which we spoke about. For governments, markets were becoming a threat, whatever their material benefits might be. And also economic peace was beginning to be increasingly difficult to sustain. Tensions were once again on the rise, throughout the world. And by the 1970s, this would multiply exponentially. And we would see the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. And so this is when the historical moment then that international political economy began to reconstitute itself as a unified field, where all these kind of factors came in together to demonstrate the necessity of considering the economic and the political together. And then this will lead to us thinking about our more modern international political economy theories, which we'll introduce as well next week, such as realism, liberal institutionalism, world systems theory, for example. So this is where we'll leave our lecture today. So just to recap again, this was about the brief post World War II period. We went back slightly before World War II to have a brief understanding of the global economy leading up to World War II, especially the ideas of economics and economic theory. And then we had a look at, well, what was the Bretton Woods Conference? What was the agreement that came out of it? What was the international institutions that came out of it? What was the idea of the Western industrialized states backed by a Keynesian economic program? What was the idea of development at that time? And how did that even shape gendered relations inside the household? Then we turned our mind to some models of development, the neoclassical idea of what development should look like, how post-colonial countries, try to get to these ideals of modernization, but then difficulties in achieving that started to recreate new theories of development, the dependency theorists, which will become more important in the 1970s. And then finally, we briefly touched on, with all of these increasing interdependence between countries, more financial flows, ability or inability for many Western industrialized countries to control their economies as they once did by the 1970s. This also contributed to an increase a reconstitution of the international political economy field. So we'll leave it there. I know we've gone through a lot in quite a short time period. And next week, we'll pick up with the chaotic 1970s and then go into more detail as to what was happening at that time point. I look forward to seeing you in your tutorials this week, and thank you very much for joining me again.